introduce the next speaker, who will be most familiar to some of you. He's a rather special speaker today because he is one of our own young people, one of our own Circuit Church members. At 14, Gabriel was elected a Minister of Youth Parliament for the London Borough of Enfield. He's a former chair of the Enfield Methodist Circuit Youth Ministry, and he's also a writer. He has published his first book already, and it's called The Escape, A Tale of Change and Revolution. And he wrote that book when he was only 17. He is currently studying politics and international relations at UCL, and we're particularly thrilled to have him as a speaker today, being such a young person in the society in which we live. He happens to be the son of Reverend Valentin, and I'm sure that is instrumental in the creating of the sort of young man he has become. But we're delighted to have you, Gabriel. Thank you so much for coming, and we welcome you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. So our presentation today, our last one, is called Creating Utopia, Understanding the Language of a Youthful Uprising. So I think the title of this is basically discussing two things. The first is that young people want to create a brighter future. They want to create a future that is more, I guess you could say, a paradise in which we're all included, in which we can move past a lot of the problems that a lot of older people might have faced during their time. But I'm also discussing the language in which young people used to discuss these things. As I said, I'm quite literary. I'm interested in language. I'm interested in writing. So I think it's important that we understand the language that's used to move these social movements forward. And yeah, so there'll be some prompts on the screen. If you see pictures that you don't understand, don't worry, I'll be explaining. We'll have some nice stories throughout this presentation. I'll make sure to keep it brief, well, within the time that I've been given. So we are living in an ever-changing world. We are growing more interconnected as well as more divided. We are growing more educated as well as more misinformed. We are growing more socially aware as well as more delusional. These changes are rippling across our politics, our interactions on a day-to-day and in our day-to-day lives. They're rippling across our interactions and our day-to-day lives, and they are manifesting themselves through changes to our institutions. Central to these changes are the perspectives and the behaviors of the youth. They are challenging our establishments like never before, and they are equipped more than ever to understand and brace for these changes. And thank you, Reverend Dan, for mentioning at the beginning that the young people did play a part in kind of bringing this together, or inspiring this, I'd say. We did write a letter to the Methodist Church to ask them to engage with themes of race and equality. So thank you for even responding. So yeah, and in order to understand the relationship between young people and these changes to our societies, we must understand how social movements operate. I'm really interested in social movements. Social movements are basically protests that go on for a prolonged period of time, that take a community approach, that take many people, a group, not just one person, to move forward. This is actually something that I've studied at university during my protest and revolution module. So I will bring in some stuff that I learned at university here as well. So this man here is a man named Abbie Hoffman, and his picture's there to essentially talk about the type of revolution that is going on at the moment, which is cultural revolution. So when you say cultural revolution, I think in the past, you'll see many revolutions have been like the Haitian Revolution, for example, where they toppled the colonial rulers. You'll see many other different types of revolutions that were quite violent, that were quite bloody. We don't really see revolutions where people are fighting so much anymore. Right now it's about culture. So Abbie Hoffman was a man who understood this during the 1960s, and he formed the Yippie movement, which is basically a movement of many young people who were basically just living a life that was anti-establishment. They weren't really doing violent things. They were just doing things that the establishment, of course, would not have liked. They had like little prank protests, essentially. And they were doing a lot of reading, they were doing a lot of research, and they were using culture to fight the system rather than violence. And I think he was quite early on one of a major person to do this. And a quote that he said is, "The duty of the revolutionary is to make love." So basically what he's saying is, in the revolutions, in the cultural revolutions that people have nowadays, it's more about our interaction, it's more about compassion towards one another instead of fighting violently. He also said famously that he's trying to combine the styles of Fidel Castro and Andy Warhol. So essentially saying Andy Warhol, an artist who, you know, his whole thing was using pop art to engage with the masses, and Fidel Castro was literally a ruler who used politics, and he's basically combining the two, which is what young people see themselves as doing today. But Abbie Hoffman in the 1960s was not the first person to speak about a cultural revolution. So Priyamvada Gopal, she is a professor at Cambridge. She wrote a book called Insurgent Empire, which was published 2019. And a quote from her book says, "In the context of both anti-slavery and anti-colonialism, freedom was a contested concept. Its content emerging dialogically determined through experience and struggle." So she's writing about all different anti-slavery and anti-colonial groups, such as the Mau Mau Rebellion, many different insurgencies like the Morant Bay Rebellion as well, in Kenya as well. All types of different groups that have fought against their colonial rule. And I've highlighted two words there, dialogically and experience. Dialogically is actually not a word I was familiar with before I'd read this text, so I had to go look it up. And what it means is that it's centered around discourse, it's centered around dialogue. So a lot of the language that these people were using, a lot of these anti-colonial groups, was through dialogue that they started to fight against the colonial rule, and experience. Through the things that they experienced, they began talking about these problems with one another. They began having discussions, and through these discussions, they formulated their own philosophies as to how they could topple their rule. So before anything even became violent, they had that cultural revolution. They unshackled their minds before they unshackled their hands, before they unshackled themselves, which is really important. And when I read this, I was thinking about, you know, in the Methodist Church, how can we think of this? Because this is actually something that has happened for many different African churches, even beyond Methodist Church, so just African Christianity in general. And there is a book which I read that I'll read an extract from, which talks about this as well. So it says, "As a movement of liberation, struggling against oppressive and exploitative forces from both outside and within the African continent, the African intellectual output generated by the negritude and the Black personality campaigns placed a theological compulsion upon African Christians, and especially the church, which in the eyes of the missionaries trained nationalists was an instrument of imperialist oppression. In response, African church leaders and African Christians and church leaders began a careful survey of this movement of liberation that was throbbing through the life of the continent." So what this extract is basically saying is that if you look at many of the African churches, a lot of us came, so when I say African churches, I don't mean in the UK, I mean in the continent of Africa and even in the Caribbean. A lot of them exist only because of missionaries that were basically colonizers that came under the guise of religion, and it was looking at how we can actually reinvent our religion, reinvent our Christianity to encapsulate the experience of these Black people in order to make them included. And this book is actually called Reconstruction and Renewal in African Christian Theology. It was written by my dad, Valentin Deji. It's a very good book, I must say. And another one, so all of these ideas, many scholars place it under the Caliban model, is what it's called. So in Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, there is a slave called Caliban, and he's taught to speak the language of his slave master, but then he uses his own language to escape slavery and make himself free. So a quote that he says in the play is, "You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. The red plague rid you for learning me your language." So you taught me your language, and the only thing that I really got from that is that I learned how to curse. I learned how to talk like you. So curse you for learning me your language. So through the same language that he's been taught, that he's been oppressed with, he is now using to liberate himself. And that's basically what cultural revolution is about. It's about learning language, it's about learning culture, it's about learning things that may have been foreign to us, but using that information to escape and emancipate ourselves from the problems that we see in society today. So the key to understanding all of these different groups is that they started from a place of cultural learning. They took time to understand their history and their environment, thus their social movements grew as a result of their studies. Many young people today see themselves as successors of groups like these. With information being readily available to us now more than ever, the term educate yourself has become a frequent fixture within debates, specifically debates online, prompting young people to learn about their environment. But is this always a good thing? So this is something we need to think about. And I have a story which I'll say now, and then I'll describe why these pictures are here. So I did my GCSEs in the year 2018. When I did my GCSEs, so I remember in our biology paper, we have these things called required practicals. So you have practicals that you do in class. You have to study these practicals. And then when it gets to the exams, they'll ask you a question in the exam about these practicals. And one of the practicals that we had to do, I think, is still in the curriculum now. You have to learn about osmosis. So how particles move in and out of substances through the membrane, etc. It's been a long time since I learned that, so if I've got it wrong, apologies. I know my mum says she's a science teacher, so apologies. But so yeah, so we're studying osmosis, you're studying potatoes, etc. And when it got to the exams, they asked us a question, but they did one thing different. Instead of asking us about potatoes, they asked us about carrots, which is a really strange thing to many people. They were like, why have you asked us about a carrot? This is so strange. And many people came out saying, oh, they know they've got that wrong. And I think many people probably did get that wrong because they were quite confused as to why they would confuse us with a carrot. But one thing that was perplexing to me is that there was really nothing different about whether or not it was a potato or a carrot, because the whole reason that you have the required practicals is to learn the logic behind all these experiments, to learn the processes behind which things happen. And then even if there are small changes like a carrot instead of potato, you'll still be able to understand because that logic would be embedded in your brain. So one thing I got from that is many young people are learning nowadays, well, not even nowadays, I think this is just a cultural thing. Perhaps it's something about the naivety of young people, who knows. But one thing that young people do is that they learn conclusions rather than try to understand logic. And if you look at social media nowadays, we have something called infographics. So that's all the things that you can see on the screen here. And these infographics, like the examples here, they a lot of the time take the form of main clauses, they take the form of conclusions. So young people do exactly what they did for that biology exam. Instead of understanding the rationale and the processes behind things, instead of understanding the logic and learning things dialogically or through experience, as Priyambada Gopal said, they're learning just conclusions. So one of these is from a feminist page, one of these is from a page called Black Students Matter, another one is a body positivity page. And essentially, I'm not even saying that there's a problem with the content that they're putting out. What I'm saying is that if you're only putting conclusions there and you're only telling people, you know, just copy these things, repeat them elsewhere, they're going to find themselves in situations just like that exam where if something changes slightly, they won't be able to adapt to that situation. So I do think that has a lot of problems. It causes a lot of problems for social movements. It causes a lot of issues. And yeah, here's another story, and I'll show you how that issue comes into place. So this is an article from The Guardian. It was written by a man called Michael Safi from Delhi in 2019. And the article reads as this: the Bengal famine of 1943 was the only one in modern Indian history not to occur as a result of serious drought, according to a study that provides scientific backing for arguments that Churchill-era British policies were a significant factor contributing to the catastrophe. Pardon me. 5 of the famines were correlated with significant soil and moisture deficits. An 11% deficit measured across the much of North India in 1896 to 97, for example, coincided with food shortages across the country that killed an estimated 5 million people. However, the 1943 famine in Bengal, which killed up to 3 million people, was different, according to the researchers. So through the Eastern Indian region affected, though the Eastern Indian region was affected by drought for much of the 1940s, conditions were worse in 1941, years before the most extreme stage of the famine, when newspapers began to publish the images of the dying on the streets of Kolkata, then named Calcutta, against the wishes of the colonial British administration. So more recent studies, including those by the journalist Madhushri Mukherjee, have argued the famine was exacerbated by the decisions of Winston Churchill's wartime cabinet in London. Mukherjee has presented evidence the cabinet was warned repeatedly that the exhaustive use of Indian resources for the war effort could result in famine, but it opted to continue exporting rice from India elsewhere in the empire. Rice stocks continued to leave India even as London was denying urgent requests from India's viceroy for more than 1 million tons of emergency wheat supplies in 1942 to 43. Churchill has been quoted as blaming the famine on the fact Indians were breeding like rabbits and asking how, if the shortages were so bad, Mahatma Gandhi was still alive. Mukherjee and others also pointed to Britain's denial policy in the region, in which huge supplies of rice and thousands of boats were confiscated from coastal areas of Bengal in order to deny resources to the Japanese army in case of a future invasion. So many young people have learned about this through social media. It's something that people have been beginning to understand now, that there was a famine in India during the year 1943, which killed up to 3 million people in a year. Just to put that into context, we often praise Winston Churchill for fighting against Hitler. Hitler had the Holocaust. He killed 6 million Jews over about a 4 or 5 year period. That's 6 million Jews across a 4 or 5 year period. 3 million Indians died within a 1 year period because of this famine. So this is one reason why a lot of young people don't like Winston Churchill. Now, we know the statue debate. We've seen this picture before, and I even want to, okay, it's fine. So I wanted to do a poll, but I don't, because I'm sharing the screen, I don't want to mess up the presentation. So one thing I'll ask you rhetorically in the breakout rooms, you can discuss this, is that you've seen this picture before. You've seen that there's been a debate about whether or not a Churchill statue should be put up there, but you've probably never heard about this famine. You've probably never heard of this treatment towards Indians, and there's been many different cases of treatment towards Black people, treatment towards other people in the UK. And abroad as well, in terms of his foreign policies. So I think the rhetorical question kind of is, what kind of world do we live in where it's more normal to just have one statement here, Churchill was a racist, instead of explaining the processes by which you think he was a racist, by which you think his statue should be taken down. I'm not saying, this is by no means a way of saying, yes, Churchill's statue should be taken down. I think you can have discussions about that and you can have your own opinions. All I am saying is that we should definitely look at the way in which people are operating nowadays, in which it's very easy to make statements, make conclusions, and be rewarded for that, rather than explaining your logic and explaining the rationale behind things. So that is a problem that I'll say with young people and social movements. And yeah, one product of that, I'll say, so this was a debate, a Black Lives Matter debate on ITV. I think I was quite upset watching it, not because there was anything really bad said, but if you watch this debate live on TV, there's so many different representatives from all the different corners of society that were representing different views. but none of them were really able to come to a cohesive conclusion. If you saw it, there was just a lot of arguing, a lot of lack of cohesive dialogue. And I think that's one of the products that this type of conclusion culture has put forward. And you can look at all these different types of people. So that's David Olusaga, that's John Barnes. I forgot the name of this man. It's quite embarrassing. He's a reporter. I've forgotten his name now. You have Sean Bailey, Shantae J, Cressida Dick, and the brother of Stephen Lawrence, Stuart Lawrence there. So all of them represent different parts of society. And even a moment where Shantae J, who was the representative there for young people, it would have been a great moment to see her shining, which I do think she spoke well during the debate. But it's just that place in society where when you're in a room where you're with all these different representatives, it's really hard to get the message forward just because of how society has gone. And there's even something called epistemic bubbles where because of how social movements operate on social media nowadays, people are very often only following people who represent their own views. So, you know, you're right, they any opinion that they have, they just believe that they're correct because it's like an echo chamber. And there's a documentary about this, The Social Dilemma, is on Netflix, which also talks about this as well. So there's an idea called channeling. I have a professor at University College London called Dr. Katerina Tertichnia, and she's essentially studying how social movements are being sidelined by a lot of authority figures. So there's different examples of how this happened, but I've used this picture to basically give a metaphor of how it happens. So if you look at young people or social movements as this man here, you can think of it as, instead of having that one partner there who's there in shock, like the person who, okay, so yeah, so you can look at that partner there as a grassroots community activist. So during the Black Lives Matter movements, these are the people who are really fighting to make sure that things are happening. These are the people who are making sure that resources were allocated to different communities. And then you have the electoral politicians, the presidents, etc., who also have a part to play in politics, but they're not the ones who are fighting with the day-to-day, the small problems that that young people are dealing with. However, by using the same words, because we have this conclusion culture where just using the correct words can give you brownie points and can make you successful. So just by them using the right words, they can sideline the community activists and the people who are actually trying to make change. And they can create a nemesis that basically is different from the one that the young people may have originally been fighting for, but it quite easily sidelines them. So if we look, the word white supremacy was used a lot in the last election. Joe Biden promised to fight white supremacy and take it down. But if we look at some of the things that are part of white supremacy, so a colonial mentality, the same mentalities that basically underpinned colonization. So you have the AFRICOM system, which was established in 2007, expanded around 2010. Is basically a military unit that goes across Africa, is controlled by the US, but it still operates in Africa to this day. Does a lot of things. The mistreatment of indigenous land. So a lot of people may know that the white people that we see in America nowadays, they colonize that land and they sideline the people that are there. And I guess is an ideology of white supremacy that through their whiteness, they are superior to the people who the land belongs to. There's also ideas of immigrant intolerance. So there's the ICE, which is established in the year 2003. They had an $8 billion expansion in 2012. And there's other things of racial injustice like police brutality, etc. When they're saying that they're going to topple white supremacy, like the Joe Bidens and the other electoral politicians, they mean that they're going to topple Donald Trump. They mean that they're going to topple his rule. Whereas white supremacy is a much larger social issues that a lot of young people, a lot of community activists were fighting towards. And this is just one example of how young people and young community activists can get sidelined out of their own movements, because simply by other people adopting the language that they used. they're no longer the center of the battle that they're trying to fight. So we have to think, what happens to these grassroots organizations who are actively trying to combat these issues, and how much does it hinder their efforts for us to be in a system where this conclusion culture allows their words to be taken away from them. However, I do think that young people still do understand many issues, and I'm coming to the close now. So I just want to touch upon loads of different words that young people use, because even though I do believe that they can get sidelined by using words, I do believe that they understand the words that they're using. So some of the words are intersectionality. Intersectionality just means, how do different problems interact with each other? How does poverty interact with race? How does sexism and gender interact with race? How does pardon me, how does class interact with race, etc.? White supremacy, privilege, white fragility, identity politics. So how does identity play a part in politics? Who you are? How does respectability politics become important? So people just trying to make sure that they can be respectable when having their image, kind of watering down their message to be respectable to others. Cultural appropriation. So that's when one culture is like taken by another culture, reappropriated to as if the culture that basically originates from doesn't exist. Allyship, which is basically partnership and making sure that we can have people who fight for the same thing that we're fighting for. Critical race theory, which is a theory that was put forward more by intersectional feminists. So people who are trying to understand how race plays a role in how the structure of our history plays a role in race relations today. And the reason why I say intersectional feminists did put this forward a lot is because they felt sidelined by feminism as a whole. A lot of Black feminists didn't feel as if feminism included them. So intersectional feminism studied things like critical race theory and saw how race affected women. So it links to intersectionality as well. Microaggressions, so the small actions that are kind of hidden racism, just in the way that people talk. Institutional racism, so the racism of institutions, the kind of again hidden racism, how institutions are just structurally racist. Unconscious bias, so bias that just exists in your head. Performative activism, just activism that, you know, you're doing it for show, you're not really doing it for the action. And capitalism, which is the structure of, you know, money and just self-determinism and making yourself richer, and how does this affect race, etc. And here's some books that a lot of young people have been reading nowadays to understand race. So White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Race, is a book by sociologist Robin DiAngelo, where she essentially talks about her own struggles talking about race and why other white people might struggle. Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Odo Lodge, a book by another blogger who talked about why she doesn't want to discuss race anymore. And So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluwo, and some classics of anti-racism. All About Love, New Visions by Bell Hooks. She's another intersectional feminist, and that's not a typo. There are no capital letters in her name because she thinks that language has been used as a form of oppression and therefore chooses not to follow laws of grammar as a means of emancipation. You could say that follows the Caliban model that I referenced earlier. The Autobiography of Malcolm X, Black Skin, White Mask by Franz Fanon, Wretched of the Earth by Franz Fanon, and Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism by Kwame Nkrumah. So I'll finish this with some main questions to the Methodist Church, because this is a Methodist discussion. So in terms of discussion, how are you as the Methodist Church ensuring to challenge young people to engage in healthy dialogue concerning matters that affects them? Are you listening to their qualms, or are you acting performatively? What concrete actions are you taking to ensure that you are a Christ-filled institution, welcoming and giving rest to all who are weary and heavy burdened? And in terms of support, if you are offering any, are you doing so to prevent dissent? Or are you empowering young people's social movement rather than sidelining them? So yeah, thank you for listening to this presentation.